Good afternoon. Good afternoon. My name is Adam Schwartz, and I'm going to be hosting this web chat to discuss the column I did in RE Magazine earlier this month on diversity. So the thesis of the article is that if we do a better job of embracing diversity at all levels of our cooperative organizations, from the boardroom to the break room, that our co-ops will be more in touch with the members who are serving, better able to serve their needs, and be seen as more engaged by the members that we are serving. That if they see people like them in leadership positions at their co-op, that they're more likely to feel that the co-op has their best interests at heart. So with that, I certainly welcome anyone who's out there to type in a question or a comment or a reaction you have to the article, or maybe describe some of your own experiences with creating a more diverse environment at your co-op, or some of the obstacles you may have had in doing that. So I'll be looking at the chat box, as will Scott Hoffman from NRECA, to monitor that, and be happy to respond to your questions and comments. In part, one of the reasons why I chose that topic is part of my own awareness around this topic that's been growing over the past couple of years. And then recently there was a study that was released by a group called Acorn International that has done some research on co-ops, particularly in the southeastern part of the United States, that was critical of the lack of diversity in leadership positions, particularly at the board and CEO level, and happy to discuss that a little bit further as well. And part of, I feel and have felt a little bit awkward about this topic. So let me just say this, right up front. I am a 55-year-old white male. That's probably painfully obvious to everyone. And it wasn't until a couple years ago that I was challenged for the first time about my privilege. And frankly, I didn't feel very privileged growing up in very modest means in Brooklyn, New York in the 60s and 70s. But over time have come to realize that that given certain advantages I have just because I was born the way I am, it does entitle me to certain privileges, or it has, whether it should or not, but it has, and how we can start to have an honest conversation about this at all levels of our organizations. Because I'm clearly of the belief now, having talked to a pretty good number of people of different races, colors, ages, about this issue, that we are going to be much stronger and better organizations if we have these kinds of conversations about how we can create a more diverse work environment, and how we can do things to encourage diversity at all levels of the organization. I think there was one question. I'm just going to check. And okay. You mentioned in the column that co-op boards should have a succession plan that includes actively recruiting women, minorities, and younger candidates. Can you talk about some specific strategies for doing that? So, one of the things that I run into when I talk about this topic, particularly with boards, is that they'll say, well, hey, our election process is open and fair. And, in some cases, it's a pretty low threshold of maybe 15, 25, 50 signatures via petition to be a candidate on the board. And I would agree, that is That is a pretty low threshold. The question is, do your members know about that? And what has the co-op done to encourage people to be aware of what's involved in running for the board? What are the duties and responsibilities of a board member? What's the compensation? What are the requirements of this? What are we doing to showcase and tout the fact? And then in particular, if our board is comprised mostly of people who look like me, what are we doing to reach out to other parts of the community that might not currently be represented on the board? Are we talking to representatives and community leaders from other minority groups that might be in the community? And saying, hey, we've got a board election coming up in a couple of months. We'd like to have a competitive race for the election, and we think that encouraging a diverse pool of candidates to run for this board would be important. Do you have any potential candidates or people that you might suggest that we talk to and aggressively reach out to so that we can have a conversation with them and see what their level of interest might be in running for the board, and make sure that they fully understand all of those responsibilities. So for me, it's not just a matter of being passive and saying that, hey, anyone can run for the board. I think the vast majority of co-op boards are open in that regard. It's the question of whether we're willing to take the next step and be active in our recruitment, realizing that it is in our best interest, and when I say our, in the co-op's best interest, to leapfrog forward and say that other than just being open, we're actually going to aggressively pursue a strategy that makes sure that people of all ethnicities and gender are welcome to serve on our board. So it's a matter of sort of just taking that next step that I think is critically important. Another question that came through here is, without naming names, can you talk about some board policies that you've seen that have a tendency to suppress more diverse participation? I would say it's not so much policies that boards adopt, but it's maybe laziness in some cases, where, hey, it's not broke, so it doesn't need fixing. But it's depending on whether it's broke or not, depends upon your perspective. And maybe things have just been cruising along, we're going along this pace, and it doesn't seem like it's broke from your perspective. So why do we need to change it? There was a management book written several years ago that had a fun title that said, if it ain't broke, break it, as a way of getting people to sort of self-disrupt before someone else comes in and offers the disruption, which might be less welcome and even more disruptive than if we take a look at ourselves. So one of the things that I think that's real important for us to consider doing is to look at this from an outsider's perspective. If I was not on the board, if I was not an employee of the co-op, if I was not intimately involved in the workings of the co-op, if I just looked at the process of how we're going about electing board leaders, would it seem fair to the average person? So one of the processes that a lot of co-ops use, and with good reason, I don't fault them using this, is the idea of having a nominations committee. So the nominations committee screens candidates, making sure that they meet the minimum requirements that the board has established. And in most cases, those minimum requirements, of what I've seen, are very reasonable, that the member be in good standing, obviously not be in default on their electric bill. That seems quite reasonable. That potentially that they don't have any convictions against them for embezzlement and things like that, which could be a problem for someone in a fiduciary responsibility on a board. So I think some of the basic requirements are very fair. Where I think we run into potentially a little bit of trouble is how those nominations committees are selected and how they go about doing their work. So if the nominations committee is simply selected by all the current board members, well, then to someone on the outside, that might have an appearance of maybe that's not so fair. It might be very fair, but the appearance might not seem fair. So just making sure that we're transparent about how that nominations committee is doing their work, making sure the nominations committee aggressively seeks to identify additional candidates rather than just the incumbents, and that we have a competitive election. So if we do that, I think the nominations committee process can work very well and makes a lot of sense. Uh, in the old days, it was common for there to be nominations taken from the floor at annual meetings. Personally, I'm not a fan of that because it doesn't allow for any vetting of candidates to see what potentially might be in their background. But we want to make sure that the vetting is done on a fair and equitable basis, and that no one is disenfranchised in any way because of that vetting process. So again, nominations committee, I think, is a very appropriate role, but we want to make sure that it is done fairly and the appearance is done fairly. Another question that has come through, any co-ops that you've come across that are doing particularly good things in the area of encouraging diversity? And then this questioner said, I know Pernalis in Texas made some very significant changes to their policies that have paid off in this regard. Pernalis, I believe, is now maybe the only electric co-op in the country that has a majority female board composition. So yes, they definitely have made some great strides. And that's another area that is, I think, one of the reasons for us to be as inclusive as possible in attracting board and employees. We'll get to employees a little bit more in just a moment. But on the board side, just to make sure that we're getting the most diverse set of opinions out there. One of the sort of throwaway questions I ask in my workshops is anyone here know of a board with just one person? It's a dumb question, admittedly, right? But the reason why I ask it is because, of course, it would make no sense to have a board with one person. But boards were designed to have 7, 5, 9, 11 people because we want that diversity of opinion. So if we have all people that all have the same experiences and the same background, then we're limiting ourselves for what boards are designed to do, and that's give us that diversity of opinion. And there's an old saying that where you stand depends upon where you sit. Right. So the idea of attracting people of different backgrounds who have different life experiences will be very helpful for the board as it's deliberating and making decisions that affect not just those 9 people in the boardroom, but all of the members, and indeed, even more than that, the community as a whole. And because of my belief that all co-ops are somewhat connected, that really impacts the co-op movement as a whole, and how we act is judged not just by the people within our co-op, but by other co-ops as well. Pardon me. So, and then as far as other co-ops, there was a story in RE Magazine a couple months, maybe a year ago or so. I believe Magic Valley was one of the co-ops down on the border that was featured. So really, what we need to be doing, and one of the things I mentioned in the article is I think it's critically important that every co-op know what the demographic background of their membership is. And that's just a core base knowledge of information that we should have that's available through Census Department data that you can look by zip code as to what the demographics of your service territory are, and then make as good attempt as possible to ensure that the employees accurately reflect and that the board members accurately reflect that diversity. Now, that's not going to happen overnight. And that's okay, but just show that there's a willingness to do this. And one of the interim ways that can be done is member advisory committees, which are unelected positions, which can be served by appointment. One of the things I've touted I do a fair amount of work with the youth tour program. I'm a big fan of having a youth representative on member advisory committees because maybe they're under 18 now, but they're not going to stay that way for too long. And as those members grow older, we want to know early on what their viewpoints are because these are our leaders of the future. We need to take into to account what their opinions are, what services we should have, what things we should be doing in the area of economic development. Another question I ask, it's going to seem silly when I say it, is how many of you would live in your community if it didn't have electricity? Well, thankfully, everyone says they wouldn't, right? Because that's just an impossible thing to imagine that we would live without electricity. And then I ask the question, how many of you would live in your community without broadband? And a couple of hands go up. And generally, they tend to be older folks who raise their hands. And in part is because their experience with broadband may not be the same, and with internet connectivity and the value of having high speed may not be the same as some younger people. But I can tell you this, that for young people in your community, living without broadband is the same thing as asking the question, would you be willing to live without electricity? And so, and that's where this diversity of opinion can be very helpful. Is that if you can help see it in that light, and then maybe that gets the board to consider, well, if we're not going to get involved in the broadband business, maybe we need to look for other partners in our community, maybe a rural telephone co-op or other business in the community that would do that. So that's, I think, one of the tangible examples of how diversity can help spur some thinking that would help the co-op and help the community as a whole. One last question that came up in the article, I did mention this Rural Power Project report on co-op boards in the South. And I asked, can you talk a little about what's in that report and why it's a concern for co-ops nationwide? So the report was released in early May. And it does an analysis of co-ops in 11 states, from Virginia across to Texas, looking at the racial diversity and gender diversity of the co-op boards to the extent that it was possible to find that out through public records. I cannot speak to the validity of all the research. I have not independently verified it. So there may be inaccuracies in the report. I'm sure there are because there were a couple I've seen. But whether there are some inaccuracies or not, there's also some truth in that report. And to an outsider reading it, they're not going to know what's inaccurate and what's truthful. So I think it's just a good reminder and a wake-up call for us, because there was a time in our electric co-op history when I know that every member of the co-op said that they were a member of the co-op. They did not define their electric provider as a utility. They talked about it as a co-op because their door was knocked on. Their farm or ranch was solicited by a neighbor for the $5 so that they could become one of the founding members of that co-op. And then over time, what's happened is we've kind of morphed a little bit away from being just a co-op, and a number of co-ops now are probably identify more as a utility than as a co-op. That's another question I ask in my workshops, and people readily admit that, and they'll say that there's a difference with depending on who you ask that question. So I think it's just a good reminder to us that this co-op model is the best business model on earth. That's one of the things I talk about a lot, and I firmly believe it. But it's only the best business model on earth if we continue to live up to it. And if we continue to make sure that all of the things that make co-ops great, we actually live up to those principles and values and exercise them on a daily basis so that those muscles do not atrophy. So that's my hope in talking about this issue. I think every journey begins with a step, and this kind of issue just begins with a conversation, just having a simple conversation. Pardon me. About the topic and how we might raise the issue internally. So with that, unless any other questions have come through, I thank you for your kind attention and giving me the opportunity to talk about this topic. And I look forward to future web chats, which we'll be discussing future articles that will be appearing in our magazine. So thanks very much. Have a wonderful rest of your August and great day. Take care.